October 5th, 1941. In the scorched fields near Mtsensk, the air tasted of burning oil and pulverized earth, a flavor that had become the staple diet of the retreating Red Army. The German Army Group Center, fueled by seemingly limitless logistics and the brutal efficiency of the Blitzkrieg, was closing the final decisive distance. Moscow was no longer a distant theoretical objective. It was a matter of weeks, perhaps days, before the assault batteries were sighted on the horizon. The orders coming down the command chain were fragmented, often contradictory, and universally soaked in desperation. Field Marshal von Bock's panzer armies had executed the massive encircling maneuvers at Vyazma and Bryansk, trapping hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops and re-ring the traditional Soviet defense lines non-existent. Those few units who managed to escape the encirclement found themselves forming desperate, makeshift battle groups, often without reliable communications, almost always critically low on fuel and ammunition. Every Soviet soldier understood that the concept of orderly retreat had dissolved into the grim reality of survival. The distance between the front line and the capital had become the most precious commodity in the entire war. For the tank crews, particularly those of the 4th Tank Brigade, commanded by Colonel Mikhail Katukov, the task was utterly impossible. Hold the line where no line existed. They were equipped with the new, formidable T-34 medium tank. On paper, it was the answer to Soviet prayers. Its sloped armor deflected German 37mm shells like heavy raindrops, and its powerful 76mm gun could punch clean through the Panzer III and IV at combat ranges. Yet, these technological advantages were quickly eroding. Mechanics often had to cannibalize 2 or 3 broken machines just to keep one operational. The training was often non-existent. Crews were being rushed from the factories straight into the fires of the front, guided more by fury than by formal military doctrine. They were fighting not just the professional mechanized infantry of the Wehrmacht, but also the cruel imping clock of the Russian winter, which was still holding its breath. The realization dawning on every commissar and every weary driver was stark and terrifying. Soviet large-scale defensive doctrine had collapsed entirely. The grand counter-offensives promised by Stalin months ago were proving to be mere phantoms in the face of German operational superiority. What remained was a brutal, chaotic, one-on-one fight against history's most formidable mechanized army. The T-34 was not merely a highly advanced weapon system. It was the physical, mobile manifestation of the Soviet will to survive, the last piece of hardened steel capable of imposing any meaningful delay on the German juggernaut. The focus narrowed now to Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Lavrenenko. Lavrenenko was an officer known not for careful textbook maneuvers, but for ferocious, audacious close-quarters combat. He had already established a fearsome reputation, understanding that the T-34's speed and low profile were its greatest defenses. He saw tanks not as support for infantry, but as instruments of shock tools for rapid, destructive raids deep behind enemy lines to shatter their infrastructure and their morale. His unit, comprised of 4 remaining operational T-34s, was ordered to plug a sudden, critical gap that had opened near Serpukhov, a vital railway junction the Germans needed to consolidate their advance routes toward Moscow. The intelligence reports were ominous. A fully armed, heavy German armored train, designated Panzerwaffe 28, was moving into position, acting as a mobile fortress and artillery battery, clearing the way for German infantry units, preparing a decisive push. For Lavrenenko, the target was not just the locomotive and its attached gun cars. It was the artery feeding the German heart, pumping unstoppable momentum toward the capital. His mission was suicidal, requiring 4 tanks running on fumes to neutralize an attack that should have required a full armored regiment. The fate of the capital depended on a few desperate minutes of violence. His objective was simple, demanding, and almost impossible. Stop the train. Prevent the German supply route from solidifying. Stop the advance. He knew that conventional engagement was not enough. He needed something catastrophic. March 12, 1944, 3:45 p.m., near the key railway junction outside Proskurov. The low rumble that had been theorized for the last hour now became a visceral, grinding reality, cutting through the thin air like a prophecy fulfilled. Lieutenant Klimov, eyes glued to the binoculars, watched the heat haze shimmer above the eastern horizon line, slowly resolving into a colossal, segmented shadow. It was the train. But it was not merely a transport. It was a rolling leviathan, an engineering marvel designed for total war. Its locomotive was encased in massive boilerplate armor, sloped and angled to deflect heavy shelling. Artillery cars bristled with 88mm guns positioned for anti-tank defense, and heavy-caliber anti-aircraft weapons guarded the flanks. This was the Iron Serpent, an unstoppable delivery system for German strategic materials, ammunition, and fresh troops. If it reached the junction, the advance would solidify, and the fate of the capital would be sealed. Klimov pulled his eye away from the lens, the grim realization hitting him with the force of an unspent shell. Their T-34s, even operating as a unit, could not win a conventional fight. The 76mm guns would chip away at the armor, perhaps disable a few cars, but the sheer momentum and defensive firepower of the train meant they would be annihilated before the tracks were unusable. Shelling the trackbed itself would only cause temporary delays. German engineering parties could repair that damage within hours. The objective was not delay. The objective was finality. He looked back at the armored beast, now maybe a mile distant and closing fast, its massive bulk obscuring the tracks behind it. There was only one way to ensure that rail line was catastrophically, irrevocably blocked. The block must be physical, immediate, and total. Klimov turned to his gunner, his face pale and set. Prepare to shift to maximum speed. We are going to become the stop block. The gunner didn't ask what he meant. The driver didn't argue. In that moment of desperate clarity, every man in the remaining 4 tanks understood the impossible equation: 4 lives against the capital. The tank itself, 30 tons of Soviet steel, was now designated as the ultimate weapon, a highly expensive self-detonating plug designed to rupture the very spine of the German offensive. The plan was instantaneous and brutal. 3 of the remaining tanks operating with their last few liters of fuel were ordered to launch a relentless, close-range assault, forcing the train's anti-tank crews to shift their focus laterally away from the tracks. They were fire support, their survival secondary to their role as decoys. Klimov's own tank, the designated sacrifice, held back for a calculated second, waiting for the suppressing fire to draw the immediate, lethal attention of the Iron Serpent's guns. He aimed the T-34 for the precise point where the locomotive met the heavily armored first car, the most rigid section of the entire train. Striking there guaranteed maximum energy transfer, maximizing the chance of track warping and immediate derailment. He felt the rough shift of the gears as the driver slammed the stick forward, pushing the T-34's V2 diesel engine past its red line. The tank lunged forward, traversing the last 100 meters of open field in a blurring, suicidal rush. The German guns roared, tracers slicing the air around them, missing only by feet. The momentum was overwhelming. Klimov shut his eyes for a split second, bracing against the inevitable. There was a sound unlike any explosion or shell impact he had ever experienced. A tearing, grinding, apocalyptic screech of steel meeting steel, followed instantly by the sickening crumple of massive metal. The impact was immediate and total. 30 tons of moving tank met hundreds of tons of moving train. The T-34 vanished, compressed and warped into the side of the locomotive, its main hull buckling the entire side of the armor carriage. The collision was so severe that it whipped the heavy steel plates protecting the train's wheels, forcing the lead axles violently sideways. With the track no longer able to guide the immense weight, the armored train immediately began its violent, agonizing derailment. The sheer mass of the iron serpent acted against itself, twisting the rails beneath it into broken ribbons of scrap metal. Car after car piled into the wreckage, engines seizing the massive rolling fortress brought to an instant jarring halt. Lieutenant Klimov's T-34 was now nothing more than a mangled metallic footnote embedded in the side of a ruined German behemoth. But the line was blocked. The tracks were twisted beyond immediate repair, choked with mangled steel, debris, and overturned armor cars. The Iron Serpent, meant to bring the final, deadly supplies to the German front, had become an immense, immobile tombstone. That day, the German advance did not fail because of a major offensive or a massed tank counterattack. It failed because a single tank crew, with no fuel, no reserves, and no hope of survival, made a grim, calculated decision to trade their machine and their lives for a few feet of railway track. Their sacrifice choked the strategic artery that supplied the entire sector. The vital German materials remained stranded, slowly piling up further down the line, unavailable to the units desperate to hold the ground before the capital. It was an act of profound, localized violence that had repercussions across the entire Eastern Front, forcing the German Logistics Corps to scramble for a new route. Delay the Soviet defers desperately needed. History often praises the large-scale victories, the sweeping campaigns, but sometimes the turning point rests on the impossible courage shown in a single moment. The absolute willingness of a few men to pay the ultimate price to force the world to take a sudden, sharp, and unexpected turn. October 18th, 1944, 3:40 a.m. at the rail junction outside Kovel. The Soviet tanker, Lieutenant Vasily Serebryakov, pulled the final lever, sealing his fate and that of his crew. The T-34 had been stripped of its primary purpose, its cannons silent, its machine guns unused. In the damp, pre-dawn gloom, it was nothing more than an 80,000-pound projectile aimed at the unyielding flank of German logistical power, the armored train designated Panzerzug 73. They had coasted the last kilometer, the diesel engine throttled down to a deep, muffled rumble, masked by the rhythmic clanking of the approaching train. Serebryakov, crammed into the driver's position, saw the looming black shadow of the locomotive growing monstrously large in the narrow, illuminated cone of the trackside light. The plan was not to defeat the train in battle, but to destroy the tracks, the engine, and any chance of repair for days to come. It was an investment paid for in the currency of human lives. The final surge began 50 meters out. The accelerator pedal was slammed to the floor, forcing the straining diesel engine to roar for the briefest last time. The T-34 lunged forward, the narrow guide wheels vibrating violently against the ballast as it steered directly for the main rail line. There was no maneuvering, only commitment. The world outside the narrow vision slit dissolved into a blur of speed and the deafening noise of the accelerating tank. Inside the turret, the loader braced himself against the bulkheads, listening to the impossible geometry of their situation unfold. The German engineer, seeing the unthinkable, a Soviet medium tank charging directly across the rails, perpendicular to his line of travel, had only time to pull the emergency whistle, a shrieking, useless wail that was immediately consumed by the collision. The impact was not a crash. It was a detonation of metal on metal, a singular, catastrophic sound that carried for miles across the freezing plains. The massive, angled glacis plate of the T-34 met the reinforced steel buffer plate and the boiler housing of the locomotive with a force that defied physics. For a fraction of a second, the tank was halted entirely. The velocity energy transferred into the German engine casing, instantly buckling steel plate an inch thick. Then, inertia took over. The locomotive, weighing hundreds of tons more, lurched violently to the side. The tank acted as a monstrous wedge, not only crippling the engine but forcing the forward bogies sideways, tearing the rails from the ties and digging deep into the ground. Steam immediately erupted from the ruptured boiler, mixing with pulverized earth and the smoke from the tank's exploding fuel lines. The armored cars immediately behind the locomotive piled up in a sickening accordion of twisted, splintered bulkheads. The armored train, moving at high velocity, became a self-destructing serpent of rolling steel. The noise of the secondary crashes, the artillery car ramming the troop transport, the supply wagons jackknifing and tumbling down the embankment, was deafening, lasting nearly 30 seconds after the initial impact. When the chaos settled, a profound silence descended, interrupted only by the hiss of escaping steam, the crackle of fire, and the groans of buckling steel. Serebryakov's T-34 was entombed, its front half fused into the pulverized wreckage of the locomotive, its tracks buried deep in the torn-up rail bed. The entire junction was choked with wreckage. 800 feet of track utterly destroyed, the vital artery severed a mountain of scrap metal where minutes before there had been a fast, efficient pipeline of supplies and reinforcements destined for the beleaguered front line. This silent charge, this single act of terminal violence, became the hard punctuation mark that stalled the German advance in the sector. The logistical disruption was not merely inconvenient, it was paralyzing. Rerouting an entire rail command structure required days, precious days, the Soviet defenses desperately utilized to reinforce crumbling positions. In the vast, sweeping narrative of the Eastern Front, the history books often highlight the grand maneuvers and the celebrated generals. But the true turning points, the moments that truly defined victory, often lay in the impossible courage of men like Serebryakov, who paid the ultimate price not for glory, but simply to force the world to take a sudden, sharp, and unexpected turn. Their legacy is not marked by medals pinned to a chest, but by the immovable heap of twisted steel that prove that even the most formidable technological advantage can be nullified by absolute human will. January 17, 1945, 08:30 a.m. Near the rail junction just outside Skiernieweiss, the air was not filled with the familiar roar of advancing armor, but with a deep echoing silence punctuated only by the drip of cooling oil and the faint, unsettling crackle of burning insulation. Sergeant Pyotr Grigorievich and the loader, Yevgeny Volkov, scrambled through the escape hatch of their battered T-34. Their world was a painful cacophony of ringing ears, blurred vision, and the thick, acrid pall of tank diesel mingling with the sharp, metallic stench of ruptured steam lines. They were alive, improbably so, having been protected by the sheer mass of their own dying machine, which was now inextricably tangled within the frame of the enemy. They did not speak. Speech was unnecessary. The immediate surroundings dictated the gravity of their action. The armored train, a formidable beast designed to shrug off everything short of heavy artillery, lay broken. The impact had been delivered with such focused violence that the lead locomotive's boiler had exploded, ripping the plating outward and throwing the heavy machine several meters from the rails. The coupling pins failed instantly, and the momentum of the following ammunition and personnel cars took over, slamming them into the wreckage, concertina fashion. Wagon after wagon had twisted off the track, creating a spectacular, ruinous fan of derailed rolling stock that stretched back hundreds of yards. Grigorievich, leaning heavily against the scarred glacis of the tank they had nicknamed the Protopopov, forced his eyes to track the line. This wasn't just a localized disaster, it was an infrastructural catastrophe. The line, the critical artery funneling supplies west from German reserves toward the desperate front lines, was completely, comprehensively blocked. The heavy cannon turret car lay on its side, its main gun now pointing uselessly at the winter sky. Boxes of vital Panzerwaffe rounds and crates of medical supplies had tumbled down the embankment, mixing with the debris and the inevitable, spreading stains of German blood. The surviving Soviet crew had achieved in one reckless, sacrificial moment what days of focused bombing or heavy artillery bombardment might have failed to do. They hadn't merely delayed the train, they had turned the track itself into an immovable object. To clear this mess, the Germans would require specialized heavy-lift engineering units, powerful cranes, and days of uncontested labor. And days precious, irreplaceable days were exactly what the battered Wehrmacht did not possess in January 1945. Every hour this junction remained choked meant less fuel for the remaining Panther tanks trying to hold the line, fewer shells reaching the defensive artillery batteries, and less food and warm clothing for the frozen infantry defending the vital bridges further west. Grigorievich looked back at the wreck of the Protopopov, now a silent, immovable monument wedged deep into the enemy's steel spine. Inside lay Serebryakov, the commander whose final order had sealed their fate and cemented a victory far larger than any single tank battle. The true measure of the action was not the valor required to pull the trigger, but the instant cold realization that washed over them. They had, through ultimate desperation, inserted a crucial, deliberate pause into the engine of the German war machine. The great offensives of history are remembered for the celebrated generals and the grand maneuvers, but the true turning points, the moments that truly define victory, often lay in the impossible courage of men like Serebryakov, who paid the ultimate price, not for glory but simply to force the world to take a sudden, sharp, and unexpected turn. Their legacy is not marked by medals pinned to a chest, but by the immovable heap of twisted steel that prove that even the most formidable technological advantage can be nullified by absolute human will. The twisted, smoldering wreckage became a landmark not shown on any tactical map, yet known intimately by every German logistic officer in the Eastern Command, the graveyard, where the momentum of their defense finally died. The sound that mattered most now was the deafening silence where the heavy rumble of the next supply train should have been, confirming the terrible, beautiful truth. The advance had definitively been stopped. This single act of defiance remains etched into the history of logistics, a stark reminder that sometimes the most decisive victories are won, not by cunning encirclement, but by the raw, unyielding refusal of one small crew to yield to the inevitable. November 27, 1941, 1930 hours inside the headquarters bunker of the 11th Panzer Division, 40 kilometers west of Klin. General Major Schmundt stared at the map table, the pencil lines marking the promised spearhead just miles from Moscow, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of a single field lamp. The air was thick with the smell of stale cigarette smoke and unfulfilled ambition. Outside, the temperature had dropped another 3 degrees, ensuring the ground was frozen iron, ideal for tanks, but unforgiving to men. Schmundt was expecting the confirmation for the morning assault, a final push that required thousands of rounds of heavy ammunition and a fresh supply of high-octane fuel, all promised on Rail Transport 408, due an hour ago. His chief of staff, Oberstleutnant Baer, leaned in, the tension in his shoulders palpable. The field telephone, usually buzzing with frantic updates, had been unnervingly quiet regarding the supply line for the last 90 minutes. The signal detachment reports static, your general. Not simple sabotage, but a break in the entire line near Station P3. They cannot raise the forward rail command, and more critically, they could not raise the command of Transport 408. Schmundt lowered his hand, rapping his knuckles sharply on the glass covering the map. Static means snow, Bear. We need the supplies. The attack begins at dawn, regardless of the weather. Confirm the status of the transport. A young communications officer, his face pale with cold and apprehension, stumbled into the bunker moments later, clutching a handwritten cipher sheet. He saluted weakly. Herr General, we have confirmation. Not static. A forward reconnaissance team confirmed visual inspection of the main southern rail line. The obstruction is complete. Schmundt did not look up immediately. Sabotage, partisans, shelling, no, Herr General. According to the field report, it is a catastrophic, intentional blockage. A heavy Soviet armored train carrying fuel and ordnance appears to have been struck by a single T-34 tank that rammed the lead locomotive head-on at full speed. The impact derailed the locomotive and four trailing cars, telescoping the entire front section of the train into a mountainous heap of twisted metal and wreckage. The line is blocked completely and irrevocably. We cannot bypass it. They report the Soviet crew of the tank perished in the collision, but the line is fused shut. The air in the bunker solidified. The silence was heavier than any artillery barrage. A single audacious act of terminal self-sacrifice had succeeded where entire Red Army divisions had failed in delaying the vital supply train. Bear swallowed hard, looking at the map where the planned assault vectors shone like silver threads. The fuel reserves we have are insufficient for a major mechanized push, Herr General. Not if we factor in the expected defensive maneuver time. Without the 408's ammunition cars, the heavy guns will be silenced by noon. We simply cannot hold the advance, not under these conditions. Schmund slowly stood, his focus shifting from the lines on the map to the implications of a single, obliterated T-34 crew miles away. He understood instantly that the ramming had not been a local skirmish or a desperate attempt to destroy a train's cargo. It was a strategically devastating blow delivered by a dying hand. It was an act of pure logistics warfare. The German advance, which had stretched its operational limits across hundreds of frozen kilometers, relied on the continuous, unwavering function of that single rail artery. Now, that artery was clogged by the wreckage of a Soviet tank and a German-bound train. The grand plans of the General Staff, the sweeping movements of the Panzer divisions, the ambition to seize Moscow before Christmas all had been placed on the vulnerable thinness of a rail line and the assumption that the enemy would fight according to predictable rules. The refusal of that lone Soviet crew to simply accept defeat, instead turning their tank into a fatal high-speed wedge, negated the timetable. The immediate consequence rippled backward through the entire German operational chain. Ammunition was instantly rationed. Fuel tanks were drained and reallocated. The scheduled dawn attack was postponed, then canceled, and finally rescheduled for a vague date that lay months away in the growing winter chill. This was the critical, desperately needed pause for the Red Army. That single frozen wreckage of a T-34, now a monument to audacity and refusal, had bought Moscow the vital hours needed for the Siberian reserves to arrive, fresh and ready for the counterattack. The strategic importance of this act remains deeply etched into the history of warfare, a searing reminder that the fate of millions can hinge upon the courage of 3 or 4 men in a cramped metal box, willing to trade their lives for the momentary disruption of a supply chain. They did not win a battle. They simply delayed the enemy's advance. Yet that delay was everything. The twisted frozen metal of the immobilized locomotive served not just as a physical barrier, but as the frozen tombstone marking the furthest limit of the German ambition, a physical confirmation that when men refuse to be the inevitable, can, for a glorious, terrible moment, be stopped. October 25, 1943, near the ravaged railway spur, the wreckage of the armored train was already becoming a monument, a black silhouette etched against the history of the Eastern Front. The weight of that steel, both the enemy's and their own now, lay silent, bearing witness not just to a collision, but to a critical trade. The crew of that Soviet tank, in the final shuddering instant of their lives, traded every remaining second of their personal future for the momentary disruption of the German war machine. It was a bargain struck in fire and shrapnel, the totality of individual existence exchanged for a chance, however slight, at collective survival. This lone act, born of desperation and culminating in catastrophic impact, instantly transcended tactical analysis. It was amplified and mythologized because it spoke directly to the core psychological strategy of the Soviet Union. That survival demanded absolute sacrifice, and that retreat was not just a military failure, but a spiritual betrayal. This wasn't merely bravery, it was defiance distilled, an irrefutable testament that the Red Army, even when lacking necessary resources or strategic advantage, still possessed the lethal will to destroy the enemy through sheer, overwhelming refusal to yield. The immobilization of that train was the literal and metaphoric halting of an ideology driven by mechanized efficiency. The German advance relied on the immutable order of supply lines, schedules, and superior engineering. When the T-34 crashed into that sequence, driven by men who understood their mission meant certain obliteration, they introduced chaos, the human factor, at its most extreme. They taught the enemy, in a language of twisted tracks and broken axles, that the calculated risks of industrialized warfare could still be overthrown by the uncalculated fury of men fighting for the existence of their homeland. The physical obstruction was cleared swiftly enough, but the moral obstruction, the stunning realization that Soviet resistance was willing to pay any cost, lingered. The enduring legacy of this crew is not found merely in the posthumous medals or the occasional mention in wartime journals. Their legacy is embedded in the fundamental narrative of the Eastern Front itself, the grim recognition that victory was never afforded. It was always purchased at the price of complete self-annihilation. Their sacrifice became an elemental symbol of national defiance, demonstrating to a suffering populace that the fight was worth dying for because the alternative was worse. They became the spectral representation of millions, the men and women swallowed by the vast consuming machine of the war, yet whose individual acts, taken collectively, tilted the scales of history. We look back upon such moments of absolute courage and try to measure the value of a life spent in 20 seconds of explosive action. The truth is, there is no measure. The cost was infinite to them. The quiet streets they would never walk again, the families they would never rejoin, the peace they would never see. Yet, in yielding everything, they bequeathed a piece of that future peace to those who survived. They were the anonymous, essential hinges upon which the massive door of fate swung shut on the German ambition. They exchanged the weight of their own futures for the weight of steel, and in doing so offered the fragile, agonizing possibility of tomorrow. And that is the silence of history, the thunderous sound of a few lives colliding with destiny, ensuring that memory survives the wreckage.